Yes, this is my. Are we going? I thought there'd be a thing. What is this? So yes, this is my topic. Success, which is not what the presentation is about, I'm afraid. You will see as it goes on that I sort of knew what I wanted to talk about. I kind of didn't know how to get into it as a topic. I wanted to talk about it, just basically come off with it. I did my bachelor's degree here, most of you should know, in psychology, and I'm now doing a master's degree in business school. And I was really interested in how these two things are linked, and that's obviously the personality of people who go into business, the personality of success. That said, I didn't really know how to talk about it, which is why I'm explaining that I didn't know how to talk about it. My first thought was, I know, I'll talk about fish. That makes perfect sense. Everyone can relate to these fish. It would be brilliant. It would be great. That's what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about these fish either. So I shouldn't really have put them up. But if you want to ask a clever question later, ask me about the fish, because they are relevant. Then when I get stressed, I like to score psychometrics. So I was scoring some psychometrics to try and think about what am I going to do. It's 11 o'clock, I've got this presentation tomorrow. So I scored up these psychometrics. And this is, and I made one look up for me this morning, this is the Blake Morton managerial grid. And this grid, I put the numbers in the middle for a reason. And it assesses your concern for tasks against your concern for people. So you can do a little survey and it'll tell you where you sit on this grid. Now these spots are really important. That's what I know the most about. So, what are the three elements? The three elements of the dark triad are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy or sociopathy. If you want to ask a clever question, ask me about the difference later, because there isn't one. So, what are these things? First, Machiavellianism. To be like Machiavelli. Here he is. Machiavelli, of course, wrote The Prince. Among other things, he was a political theorist, and he's very good at shrewd, cold thinking. Second thing, narcissism, is to be like Narcissus, who was it's an ancient Greek story. He was so in love with himself that he died staring at his own reflection in a pond. So, it seems that this triad wants to turn me into some sort of statue, and I'm not a statue. So the next thing I did sort of on my journey into this was I constructed, or rather I stole, because that's what you do in psychology, you steal questionnaires the dark triad questionnaire, and this is it here. So these numbers on the right here represent average scores out of 5 just in the general population. And you'll notice, where are we at here? I've gone a bit off it here. Yeah. So you'll notice that they're sort of, people score about halfway on them. I've not done this. I thought that would be too much. I thought that would be too easy. And actually the reason is that these things aren't disorders. These are personality types. They don't sit in the DSM. So let's move on. Let's start back at the top again. Let's start in narcissism. This is the one I think is the worst. And this is why being a narcissist is really, really easy these days. We have all these tools at our fingertips that we can use to become narcissists. And I thought, well, this isn't me. This isn't me at all. I don't do these things. I don't share my life on Snapchat, even if it is a fine day and I'm clay pigeon shooting. I just don't tell people. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. I know why I don't do that. It's because I'm also quite high in Machiavellianism, right? I know people will know that's what I'm doing, and I'm too smart for that. That's what's going on here. So where do we go now? All right, so we'll return to this because you'll notice Machiavellianism is the one people score the highest in. And I did score some people, and everyone was like, oh yeah, Machiavellianism. Really like the idea of being high in Machiavellianism. And who doesn't? Being high in Machiavellianism means you're a good political thinker. Who doesn't want to be this guy? Okay? Now, you'll have noticed I've missed one out, and that's the last thing I'm going to talk about, and that's psychopathy. So, what is it? Well, it's kind of a big thing, and we often think of these guys when we talk about psychopathy, but that isn't necessarily what it is. So if we drill right back to the actual science behind it, again, it's not scored in the DSM, it's not characterized as a psychological disorder. It's characterized by this, which is the Robert Hare checklist. So there are a number of things that Robert Hare and his colleagues found people who have psychopathy, or people with psychopathic traits, let's not demonize them like Robert Hare does and call them psychopaths, have. And you score yourself, or rather you are scored 0, 1 or 2 on all of these things, and it's all added up, and depending on where you live, depends on where the threshold is you have to cross. I don't cross a threshold before you start, okay? And I'm sure some of you are thinking, oh, who is this guy? Like, what is he doing? I can see him being high in loads of those things, okay? I can see him grandiose estimation of self. I can see him with his pathological lying, and I don't have that one. Superficial charm, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioural controls, irresponsibility, impulsivity. If you know what's happening here, you know that was all of the above. With sexual, we'll leave that one, so, where does this attach into business? Well, if you look at these, some of these are actually very, very good business skills. Some of these are being a good leader. Some of these are not allowing your emotions to cloud your judgment. And based sort of on what Matthew was saying, actually, is it better not to be ethical when you're making business decisions? And then I had a sort of interesting thought. Some people who are high in psychopathy do end up in the boardroom, but some of them end up in Broadmoor. And I was really wondering, what is the difference between these two things? If you've got a high in this personality trait, you might end up here, but you might also end up here. Unfortunately, that comes down to the kind of environment you grow up in. So if you grow up in the sort of environment where you're having to utilise the criminal versatility and your juvenile delinquency, you're going to end up in Broadmoor or somewhere similar. If you don't have to do that and you have the opportunity to pursue your cold, calculating mind, you might end up in a boardroom. And that's possibly an interesting issue to think about, particularly in terms of poverty, in terms of the opportunities we offer people. And yes, these are people who have psychopathic personality disorder. But nonetheless, it's really interesting to think about why you might score highly on a checklist that would, in some circumstances, put you behind bars, but in other circumstances, might have you leading a Now, most of our understanding of psychopathy is based on the criminals who are studied, because it's very easy to study people who are in prison. It's not very easy to go into a large multinational company and say, so I was really hoping that I could test all your board members for psychopathic personality traits. It's not going to return a very good investment. And there are people at this university whose job is to do that. And if you are interested, you can look at what they do. There are some people whose office is just behind you in the next wing over who look at it in children. And it's not called psychopathy in children, it's called callous and unemotional traits. Because parents don't like the idea of you telling them the little Hugo is a psychopath. So the idea here was just to sort of introduce you to this as a concept. I'm going to leave it open there. If you have any questions, I will take them. These are some of the things I looked at. That one at the top is the one about the fish. Remember, that's a really good question. And these are some books you might want to read to look into. This one's written by Robert Hare, who came up with the checklist. I don't really agree with everything Robert Hare says, personally. Some of you might not. If you want a really easy in one, the one in the middle is written by a journalist. This is the guy who wrote The Men Who Stare at Goats. That's why there is a goat on it. And this is the original Prince by Machiavelli. If you don't like reading, John Ronson's also done a really good TED talk on his book. It's about 15 minutes long. And if you want to look at it from a business perspective, there's a TED talk by Daniel Pink called Hot and Cold Thinking, which is about why being unemotional might be a better way of leading a business. I will take some questions. I will leave you with these pictures of Stewie. See how many of the checklist points you can put off against Stewie.
Stuart, thank you very much. Okay, just quickly questions. Who's going to ask it? Your hand is up first.
How are the fish relevant?
How do the fish relate? Well, the fish are actually an excellent in onto the potential evolutionary purposes of psychopathy. So it's really nice to take something like that and put it in a really sterile environment, that of animals, because otherwise I would be standing up here talking about how great rape is, and I thought that probably wasn't appropriate for this room. But instead we can talk about the fish. So you might be aware of things like the cuckoo who lay their birds in someone else's nest. But that's an entire species taking advantage of other species. One of the things with swordtail fish is they have very high sexual dimorphism. So the males are huge. The males defend an area of the riverbed, the males look after it, and that area of the riverbed is like, that's their thing, that's what gets them the females. The females are very small, they don't need to defend riverbed, they don't need to be big. It's the same reason why you'd only keep peacocks in your garden. They look prettier. However, there is a subset of the males, it's a very small subset, and they are basically what a lot of theorists believe psychopathy is in humans. They do not obey by the normal rules, they will cheat, they will sneak in and they'll have sex with the females and then they'll run away. But the reason it's interesting in the fish is they look physically different. They actually look like females. They don't need to be big, they don't need to be strong fish. So they are physically different as well as mentally different. This, of course, is based sort of on the assumption that psychopathy is an evolutionary personality trait. And in there is a sort of assessment that sexual success is the same as evolutionary success. And if anyone's studied evolutionary theory, they know that's generally equated to be the same thing. But the fish show it, as I said, in a kind of quite clean way, because they are physically different and you don't need to study their sexual behaviour.
Thank you very much indeed. Any more questions? Just a quickie.
So I took the dark triad personality chairs and I score highly and above average on all of the three concepts.
Do you?
Yes, surprisingly. But I've read that it's impulsivity control that determines whether somebody, as you say, ends up in the boardroom or Broadmoor. I was just wondering if you could tell me more about that, the impulsivity control.
Yeah, so if we go back to the Hare list, you're talking about impulsivity and to some extent irresponsibility.
Yeah, apparently that's the biggest determining factor in whether somebody is sort of antisocial or just a sort of corporate psychopath.
This one relates to some extent in with these ones up here, like manipulativeness and pathological lying. So, and there's there's this sort of glib and superficial charm. So if you ever meet a psychopath, you won't know. They'll be the nicest person in the room, if they want to be. And that's sort of where the difference lies. If you're very, very charming, you'll do very well in the business world. And if you forego being charming and you give in to this impulsivity, then you're more likely to do something incredibly violent. We've got to remember that we've got, there's criminal versatility in there, and there is violence somewhere. So, I don't know if this answers your question, because I've sort of spread the butter a bit thinner over more of the points, but it depends which ones of the behaviours you weigh onto. And remember, this checklist was made studying prisoners. There's criminal versatility, there's juvenile delinquency, and there's revocation on conditional release at the bottom. If you are a boardroom psychopath, you are not any of those things, which is why you might want to have a look at that book there. I must confess I've not read that one because I hate Robert Hare and I think he's atrocious. But that's a different topic.
Stuart, thank you very much